My name is Ethan Miller, and I grew up believing family was the safest place in the world. I am from the United States, and this is the story of the night everything I believed shattered. I was only 19 when my grandfather hosted his retirement dinner after spending 4 decades as a respected judge in our county courtroom. Everyone admired him. People stood when he entered rooms. Lawyers feared disappointing him, and neighbors spoke his name with pride. I had grown up watching him polish his shoes every morning and review case files late into the night. That dinner was supposed to be a celebration, a final chapter filled with applause, gratitude, and warmth. We gathered at an upscale restaurant downtown with golden lights and quiet music echoing off dark wooden walls. Nearly 70 guests filled the room: judges, lawyers, clerks, family, friends, and one person I never stopped watching: my cousin Ryan. He was older than me, ambitious, sharp, dressed, always calculating. Ryan had grown up under my grandfather's roof after his parents passed, and everyone said he was the success story: law degree, private firm, big house, perfect image. I admired him once, maybe too much. That night, I sat near the end of the table, quietly observing as my grandfather greeted guests, shaking hands, smiling the way men do when they are proud but tired. Ryan moved through the room like he owned it, checking details, whispering to servers, adjusting seating cards. He played the role of the devoted grandson perfectly. He even ordered my grandfather's favorite red wine from a vintage bottle he claimed he had been saving for years. People clapped when speeches began, and I felt proud sitting there listening to stories about justice, fairness, and sacrifice. But then something small changed everything. I noticed Ryan glance around the table, his smile never leaving his face, but his eyes moving fast. When he thought no one was watching, he slipped something white from his jacket pocket. It was tiny, almost invisible. He leaned toward my grandfather's glass and dropped it in the liquid, swallowed it instantly. I felt my chest tighten. I told myself I was mistaken, that my mind was playing tricks, but I saw the fizz, the quick swirl, the practiced motion. I had never seen fear move that fast through a room without sound. My grandfather did not notice. He laughed at a joke, reached for his fork, then dropped it. The sound broke the moment, and he bent down. Ryan lifted his glass without realizing what had just happened. I did not know what to do. I was frozen, watching 2 futures split apart right in front of me: the man who raised us and the man who planned something unforgivable. The toast came. Ryan stood confident, speaking about loyalty, honor, family, sacrifice, words that felt sharp in my ears because I knew what sat inside that glass. He drank, first smiling, proud, unaware that the trap had shifted. I watched my grandfather lift his own glass, calm, steady eyes, like he already understood something we did not. The room applauded, unaware that justice was already moving quietly between us. I did not know that night would end in sirens, hospital lights, and a confession that would tear our family apart. I did not know I would never look at blood the same way again, and I did not know that the next few minutes would reveal exactly who Ryan really was. So stay with me, because what happened after that toast changed all of our lives forever. The moment Ryan finished his toast, the room erupted in applause, glasses raised, smiles wide, and nobody noticed what I noticed first. His hands were shaking slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough for someone who had grown up watching poker games and courtrooms. I saw his confidence crack like thin ice. My grandfather remained calm, sipping only a small amount of his wine, while Ryan drank, deeply proud of himself, or so he thought. I remember feeling sick, sitting there, my heart pounding louder than the music. I wanted to scream, to warn someone, but fear glued me to my chair. I was just a kid compared to the people in that room: judges, attorneys, people who decided the fate of others every day, who would believe me if I stood up and accused my cousin of something so dark. The dinner continued. Plates arrived, laughter returned, but Ryan changed. His voice grew softer, his movements slower. He reached for his water and nearly missed the glass. I saw sweat forming on his forehead. Even though the room was cool, my grandfather watched him closely, eyes sharp, the same eyes that had terrified criminals for decades. Suddenly, Ryan stood up too fast, knocking his chair back. The sound echoed through the room, and conversations stopped. He laughed it off, saying he needed fresh air, but his walk toward the door was uneven, like his legs had forgotten their job. I felt my stomach drop. People whispered, servers froze. My grandfather said nothing, just folded his napkin calmly and waited. Minutes passed, then more. Victoria, Ryan's wife, stood up, panic creeping into her voice, asking where he was. Just then, Ryan stumbled back inside, pale, disoriented, eyes wide with fear. I had never seen him look small before. He tried to speak, but his words tangled together. Someone suggested calling a doctor. Another guest mentioned alcohol reaction. But my grandfather finally stood, his voice cut through the room, calm, firm, demanding clarity. Ryan looked at him, then at the glass, then at me. And in that moment, I knew he realized I had seen everything. His knees buckled and people rushed to catch him. Chaos exploded. Phones came out. Someone called emergency services. And the restaurant filled with noise and confusion. Paramedics arrived, lights flashing outside, red and blue painting. The windows. Ryan was lifted onto a stretcher, oxygen mask strapped to his face. He kept looking at my grandfather, eyes begging silently. During the ride to the hospital, I sat beside my grandfather, silent, shaking. He placed a hand on my shoulder, steady, grounding like he always had, and said nothing. At the hospital, doctors moved fast, tests, machines, voices overlapping. Finally, a police officer arrived, asking questions. Ryan was awake enough to speak. And that is when everything broke. He confessed right there, said he had put something in my grandfather wine, said he never meant to hurt him, only scare him, manipulate him into releasing money, early debts, pressure, desperation. He admitted everything in front of officers, doctors, his wife, and me. I watched Victoria crumble, watched the image of my perfect cousin collapse. Completely. Charges were filed that night, and the man I once admired was arrested before sunrise weeks later. The trial was short, evidence overwhelming, witnesses everywhere. My grandfather refused to speak. As a victim, said the truth spoke loudly enough. Ryan was sentenced. Prison time. Lost his license, lost his marriage, lost everything. I thought that was the end, but I was wrong, because the hardest part was not watching him fall. It was realizing how close evil can live to love. And what happened next changed my grandfather and me in a way I never expected. So stay with me, because part 3 is where the real consequences begin. After the trial ended, life did not return to normal the way movies pretended does. Instead, everything felt quieter, heavier, like the world had exhaled and never breathed back in. My grandfather retired officially, not with applause, but with distance. He stopped waking early, stopped polishing his shoes, stopped reading files at night. The man who once carried the law in his spine now moved slowly, like he was learning how to exist without it. I stayed with him more often after that, moving into the spare room, because my parents said it might help him, and maybe it helped me too. We rarely spoke about Ryan, but his absence filled every room. The chair at the table stayed empty. Hallway photo frames felt like accusations. I caught my grandfather staring at nothing for long stretches, and when I asked what he was thinking, He would say the same thing every time, that justice has a cost people never see. I started college that fall commuting instead of living on campus because I did not want to leave him alone. He taught me how to cook simple meals, and I taught him how to use a phone beyond calls. There were nights when he would wake from sleep breathing hard, and I would hear him pacing until dawn. He never cried, but I saw grief in the way he avoided mirrors and refused invitations. Months passed, then one afternoon, a letter arrived from the correctional facility addressed to my grandfather. He stared at the envelope for a long time before handing it to me, asking me to read it first. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. Ryan's handwriting was uneven, nothing like confident notes he once scribbled. It said he was sorry, not in a dramatic way, but in a tired one. He wrote about the silence of prison, the regret, the replaying of that night again and again. He said he did not ask for forgiveness because he knew he did not deserve it. He said he only wanted my grandfather to know that the glass was meant for control, not death. And that realization haunted him every night. When I finished reading, I did not know what to feel: anger, sadness, relief, all of it tangled together. My grandfather took the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer without a word. Days turned into seasons. Winter came, then spring. The world moved on, but something inside our house remained paused. Then one morning, my grandfather surprised me by asking to go for a drive. We ended up in the mountains, where the air felt lighter and the road curved gently. He parked near a quiet overlook, and we sat watching the sky change colors. He told me that power without integrity always rots, and that the hardest sentence he ever delivered was to someone he loved. He said that night at the dinner, he noticed the change in the wine before drinking it. He said experience teaches you when something is wrong, and he chose to let events unfold to reveal the truth fully. I asked him if he regretted it, and he shook his head slowly. He said the truth always demands witnesses, and that sometimes survival is not about stopping the fall, but stepping aside so it can be seen clearly. That was the first time I realized he had protected me too, by letting me see reality without illusions. On my birthday that year, we sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching the sun rise. He asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and for the first time I did not answer with uncertainty. I told him I wanted to study ethics and law, not to judge people, but to understand them. He smiled, then tired but proud, and just when I thought the story was ending, another letter arrived, one that would force a decision none of us were prepared to make. So stay with me, because part 4 is where forgiveness is tested in most unexpected way. The second letter arrived on a rainy afternoon, the kind that turns the sky gray and makes every sound feel distant. I recognized the return address immediately, and my chest tightened before I even opened it. This one was not from Ryan. It was from his wife, Victoria. She wrote that Ryan's health had declined, that prison was harsher than he expected, and that he was asking for one thing only: to see my grandfather once before it was too late. She did not beg, but the weight of her words pressed hard. She said, closure matters even to those who have fallen. I handed the letter to my grandfather and watched his face change, not with anger, but with something heavier. He folded it slowly and set it aside. We did not talk about it. For days, silence filled the house again, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, one evening, he asked me what I thought. I was caught off guard, because he had never asked for my opinion on matters like this. Before I told him the truth, that I did not know what forgiveness looked like in a situation like this, that I believed accountability mattered, but so did humanity. He nodded, as if he had already reached the same place inside himself. A week later, we drove to The correctional facility, the building stood cold and unforgiving, surrounded by fences and razor wire. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and regret. Ryan looked different, thinner, older eyes, hollowed by time and consequence. When he saw my grandfather, he stood slowly, unsure if he should speak. He apologized again, voice shaking, and admitted he thought control was the same as power. My grandfather listened without interruption, then said something I will never forget. He said, "Remorse does not erase harm, but it can begin repair." He told Ryan that forgiveness is not permission to return, but freedom to move forward. He wished him clarity, strength, and accountability. Then he stood and walked away without looking back. On the drive home, neither of us spoke, but the silence felt lighter, like a door had finally closed. Months later, my grandfather's health began to fade quietly, without drama. Doctors' visits, medications, early nights. He never complained. One morning, he handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it and told me to open it only when the time came. I wanted to argue, but he smiled the way he always did. When he had already decided, weeks later, he passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving the house quieter than it had ever been. At the reading of his will, I learned that he had left most of his estate to community programs and scholarships, but the house and his journals were left to me. The envelope contained a letter written in his steady hand. He said he trusted me to carry forward the lesson that justice without compassion is incomplete, and compassion without truth is dangerous. He said I was the witness he needed that night at the dinner, and the reason he had the strength to let truth unfold. I cried for the first time since the trial ended. I thought the story ended there, but I was wrong, because the journals he left behind revealed something none of us knew, and what I found inside would change my future forever. So stay with me, because part 5 uncovers the secret he never spoke aloud. I opened my grandfather's journals slowly, one by one, sitting at his old desk, where the wood still carried the marks of years of work. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates, case notes, thoughts, doubts, questions he never voiced aloud. These were not legal documents. They were confessions, reflections, warnings. He wrote about justice, not as a system, but as a burden carried by flawed people. He admitted moments where he questioned verdicts, moments where he wondered if the law healed or only contained damage. Then I reached a section marked with a folded corner, and my breath caught. He had written about Ryan years before the dinner, long before the crime. He noticed early signs: entitlement, impatience, a hunger for control disguised as ambition. He wrote that he tried to guide him, but feared pushing too hard would create resentment. He believed love required trust, and that mistake haunted him. He also wrote about me. He said I watched more than I spoke, that I noticed silence and tension others ignored. He wrote that if truth ever needed a witness, I would recognize it. That line shook me, because it meant that night was not chance. It was responsibility passed quietly. He knew something would surface eventually, and he prepared himself and me for it. As I kept reading, I found something unexpected, a sealed legal addendum hidden between pages. It was a document transferring authority of a small trust fund, not money, but access to records, letters, and case studies of wrongful convictions and ethical failures. He wanted me to study them, learn from them, and continue his unfinished work. I realized then that my future had already been written, not as a command, but as an invitation. I enrolled fully in law and ethics courses, changing my path with purpose. I began volunteering with Innocence projects, reading transcripts, meeting families, listening to stories that echoed themes from the journals. Every time doubt crept in, I remembered his words about truth demanding witnesses. Then one afternoon, another letter arrived from prison, this time from Ryan again, shorter, weaker. He wrote that he had heard about my grandfather passing and wanted me to know that the visit gave him peace. He said consequences finally made sense, that control was an illusion and accountability was the only real power. He asked nothing else. I never replied, but I did not throw the letter away. Either years passed. I graduated and stood at the same courthouse where my grandfather once ruled, not as a judge, but as a speaker invited to talk about ethics and responsibility. I told a room full of students that justice is not loud. It does not announce itself with drama. It moves quietly through choices, moments, and witnesses willing to see. I never mentioned names, but I felt his presence there, steady, approving. As I walked out of the building that day, I understood the final lesson. He did not want revenge. He wanted continuation. And just when I believed the story had fully closed, a message appeared that forced me to face the past one final time, because part 6 is where everything comes full circle and the truth reaches farther than I ever imagined. The message came late at night through an unfamiliar email address, and for a moment I considered ignoring it because some chapters feel safer unopened, but something in me recognized the weight behind it. The sender introduced himself as a journalist from another state investigating corruption tied to an old case my grandfather once presided over. He said my name appeared repeatedly in sealed notes recently released, and he wanted to understand why. A chill ran through me because the journals mentioned unfinished threads, truths delayed by timing and limits of the law. I agreed to meet him in a quiet cafe halfway between cities. He brought documents, photos, transcripts, and one familiar detail: Ryan name appeared again, not as a defendant, but as a quiet beneficiary of a decision years before the dinner. My grandfather had ruled fairly, but the outcome unintentionally protected financial interests that later fed Ryan's desperation. The journalist was not accusing, he was connecting dots, asking whether my grandfather knew the ripple effects of every ruling. I went home and reread the journals with new eyes, and there it was, a final entry written weeks before his death. He acknowledged that justice is never isolated. Every decision moves forward, touching lives unseen. He wrote that the dinner night was not just exposure of one crime, but a mirror reflecting accumulated choices. He accepted responsibility, not guilt, but awareness. He trusted that I would understand when the time came. I shared the journals with the journalist, selectively focusing on lessons, not blame. The story published months later, not as scandal, but as reflection. It sparked discussions, panels, reforms, and renewed focus on ethical education in law schools across the country. My grandfather's legacy shifted from a single respected judge to a catalyst for deeper accountability. I stood watching reactions unfold, realizing how far that one night had traveled from a glass of wine to classrooms, courtrooms, and conversations nationwide. On the anniversary of his passing, I returned to the mountains alone, sat at the overlook, and reread the first page of the journals. I finally understood the final verdict he left me. Life will test integrity quietly, not with obvious villains, but with familiar faces and subtle choices. I chose then to keep telling the story, not for drama, but for warning and guidance, because silence protects harm and witnesses protect truth. If you have stayed with me this far, remember, this betrayal rarely announces itself, and justice rarely shouts. It waits for someone young enough to notice and brave enough to stand. And if you think this is the end, ask yourself this: who is watching your glass right now?